It began with the smell, not rot, not mildew, something colder. A scent that clung to the air of the abandoned farmhouse like a memory that refused to die. When the wind pushed through the broken boards, it whispered, as if the house itself was trying to warn whoever entered. The journalist didn't come looking for ghosts. He came chasing a rumor, a story buried so deep in America, this rural heartland, that no one dared to write it down. Locals spoke of a family that stopped mixing with the world, a bloodline so isolated that their children were born different. Old women in town called them the Hollowborn. The name never appeared in records, but the pattern did, a series of unexplained stillbirths, home deaths, and missing census entries scattered across 3 generations. Each time, the names vanished from paper, but the land stayed within the same family, like the soil itself was bound by their blood. In the attic, beneath dust and silence, the journalist found them, photographs that should never have survived, faces blurred by age but not by accident, small hands with too many joints, eyes too far apart, children staring directly into the lens, as if aware that this might be the only proof they ever existed. And then, beneath the stack of photos, a small note in faded ink. They said the sickness was in the blood, but it wasn't just the blood that was cursed. That was the moment the journalist realized. This wasn't simply a story of genetic decay. It was the story of a family erased on purpose, and a truth that someone, even now, didn't want to be found. The attic was never meant to be found. Hidden behind a false wall at the end of a narrow hallway, its door was warped by age, sealed by decades of dust and silence. The journalist had followed nothing but a rumor, a whisper passed from one cautious local to another about a farmhouse that still had its secrets. The house sat deep in the back roads of rural Kentucky, surrounded by woods that seemed too quiet for daylight. The windows were boarded, the floorboards soft, and the air was heavy with something that felt more like memory than dust. When the journalist pried open that forgotten door, what escaped wasn't just air. It was the kind of cold that sinks into the bones, a stillness that felt almost aware of being disturbed. Inside, the light from his flashlight cut through webs and dust motes, revealing what looked like an ordinary storage space. But as the beam moved across the room, it began to pick out shapes that didn't belong there. Stacked trunks, leather-bound folders, and boxes labeled in handwriting that seemed to tremble with age. He opened one carefully, and inside were files, brittle from time, stamped with a faded county hospital insignia that no longer existed. The names written on the folders were unfamiliar, yet eerily similar, variations of the same few surnames repeated again and again, as if the family tree had been looping on itself for generations. Each file contained birth certificates, medical charts, and autopsy reports, most with the same note scribbled in the margins. Deformities, cause unspecified. At the bottom of one trunk, beneath the medical records, he found a bundle wrapped in cloth. The fabric disintegrated in his hands, revealing a stack of old photographs printed on thick silver-tinted paper. They were portraits, formal ones, posed carefully, but something about them was deeply unsettling. The children in the photos were dressed neatly, seated still as if for a school picture, but their eyes betrayed something else. One boy's arm seemed unnaturally long for his body. Another child's head was tilted at an impossible angle, the neck seemingly too soft to hold it upright. The expressions weren't blank. They were aware, as if they understood that the person behind the lens wasn't capturing a family memory, but evidence. Near the pile of photographs was a leather notebook, its first few pages ripped out. The handwriting that remained was hurried, desperate. The entries spoke of a sickness that follows the blood, of births that should not have happened, and of a doctor who warned them to stop before God himself intervened. The ink trailed off abruptly after a line that read, "The last child did not make it to daylight." When the journalist reached that sentence, he realized something. The attic wasn't just storing history. It was guarding a confession. The next step in the journalist's search took him beyond the farmhouse, into the quiet heart of a forgotten town whose people spoke in half-truths and silences. The local courthouse was small, its walls lined with yellowed maps and shelves of dusty ledgers. It smelled of old paper and mildew, the the kind of place where time didn't move forward so much as loop endlessly in the same stale air. He came looking for records, births, deaths, property transfers, anything that could trace the family from the photographs. The clerk on duty, an elderly man with clouded eyes and a nervous smile, hesitated the moment he heard the surname. His hands slowed, his voice thinned, and all he said was, "Those books are gone now, son. Fire took them, long time back." But when the journalist asked where the fire started, the man looked away. Still, persistence has a way of uncovering what others prefer to forget. In a back room stacked with unlabeled boxes, the journalist found what appeared to be duplicate ledgers from the late 1800s, charred at the edges but mostly intact. He opened one and began scanning down the columns. The same surnames appeared again, repeating through the years, attached to births and deaths that came too close together to be coincidence. But then, abruptly, they stopped. Entire family lines ended in the span of a decade, replaced by blank spaces or black ink streaks that looked intentionally smudged. In one ledger, the births for 1894 through 1897 had been torn out completely, the binding rough and uneven as though done in haste. He turned to property deeds next, cross-referencing the same names. The land ownership never changed hands, even after the supposed deaths. The same plot, the same farmhouse, remained registered to the same bloodline for nearly a century. Yet census records contradicted everything. The family seemed to vanish and reappear, sometimes with altered first names, sometimes with none at all. It was as if someone had rewritten their existence, cutting away the years that didn't fit the story they wanted history to tell. When he mentioned this to the county historian, she grew pale and whispered that some records had been requested for federal archiving back in the 1920s, but never returned. No one knew who made the request, only that men from the capital had come in dark cars and left before sunrise. As he pieced the fragments together, the journalist began to sense a pattern, a deliberate cleansing, not by time but by intention. Pages missing, names changed, children erased. The paper trail wasn't lost by accident. It had been buried like a body. Every missing record was another nail sealing the truth away, and the silence that hung in that courthouse felt less like decay and more like obedience. The letter arrived weeks later, slipped under the journalist's motel door in an unmarked envelope. No name, no address, only a faint hospital seal embossed on the paper. Barely visible, almost worn away by time. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, written in the kind of script that comes from a trembling hand and a guilty heart. It began simply, "If you found what was in that attic, then you've already seen my work." The journalist read the first line 3 times before realizing what it meant. The author was a doctor, the same one mentioned in the notebook found under the farmhouse beams. His tone carried both pride and regret, like a man confessing too late. He wrote of a family afflicted by the consequence of their own secrecy, of children born in hidden rooms and buried without ceremony, and of payments made in cash to ensure their names never reached official records. The letter explained how he was summoned by the family patriarch in the late 1890s to assist with what was described as a private medical matter. When he arrived, he found not illness but horror. Infants born with twisted limbs, fused spines, and faces that barely resembled human symmetry. The doctor claimed he was told to write respiratory failure or complications of childbirth on every certificate, even when the cause was clearly something far more unnatural. He confessed that after a while he stopped asking questions. The money was good, and the family's influence stretched beyond the county. Judges, clergymen, and landowners all tied to their name. It was easier, he wrote, to let the bloodline devour itself quietly. As the pages went on, his tone shifted from confession to something closer to terror. He described nights when he was kept awake in the farmhouse by faint cries echoing from the cellar, though no one was supposed to be alive down there. He wrote about a child who lived past infancy, a girl with pale eyes who never blinked and never cried. He claimed she would stand by his bedside while he slept, watching him until morning. When he told the family he could no longer continue his work, they warned him that leaving wouldn't change anything. The sickness was already part of him now, they said. Near the end of the letter, the ink began to fade, but one line stood out sharply, pressed hard into the paper, as if carved rather than written. I falsified 23 certificates, but I only buried 22 bodies. The journalist stared at that line for a long time, feeling the room close in around him. Somewhere, it seemed, one had survived. It was a month after the letter when she appeared, quiet and unannounced, at the door of the small-town diner, where the journalist had made a habit of writing his notes late into the night. She looked frail, her hands trembling as she held an old locket, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she'd seen his car parked outside the farmhouse a few weeks earlier, and that she had something he needed to hear. Her name, she claimed, was Ruth Holloway, a name that didn't appear in any of the records he'd collected, but it carried a familiar weight. When he asked how she knew about the house, her answer was simple. Because I was born there. She told her story slowly, as if each word cost her a fragment of strength. She spoke of growing up in isolation, deep in the same woods that surrounded the rotting farmhouse, raised by a grandmother who refused to let her attend school or meet anyone from the outside world. The old woman had filled her head with warnings that outsiders would never understand their kind, that they were being punished for what their ancestors did, and that some things in their blood were not meant to mix with others. Ruth remembered nights when the wind would howl through the trees and her grandmother would lock the doors, whispering prayers under her breath as if something outside was listening. The journalist noticed the faint marks on Ruth's neck, small ridges under the skin, almost symmetrical. When he asked if she was ill, she smiled, a sad, resigned kind of smile. She said the sickness had skipped her generation in form, but not in shadow. It haunted her in dreams and in mirrors. She spoke of hearing voices when she was a child, not loud ones, but soft, pleading murmurs, calling her by names she didn't recognize. One night when she was 16, she found a locked chest under the floorboards, filled with old bones wrapped in cloth, and a photograph of the pale-eyed girl the doctor had described. Her grandmother caught her and told her never to touch it again, saying that the dead had made their peace only because they were buried wrong. Before leaving, Ruth pressed the locket into the journalist's hand. Inside was a small curl of white hair and a photograph of a woman who looked exactly like her, but dated 1902. She said she did not want to be followed, that her time was almost over, and that he should stop digging before they wake again. Then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of earth and lilac and the cold realization that the bloodline hadn't died. It had been waiting. The final discovery came when the journalist returned to the farmhouse one last time, driven not by curiosity anymore, but by the weight of everything he had uncovered. The walls seemed closer now, the air heavier, as though the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for him to come back. The storm outside had turned the fields into a dark ocean of mud, and thunder cracked in the distance as he stepped over the threshold. He followed the path he knew by heart, the warped stairs, the narrow hall, the door to the attic, but this time he noticed something he hadn't before. Behind an old wardrobe, there was a faint outline on the wall, a rectangular patch of wood that didn't match the rest. He pressed against it, and the panel gave way, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into the darkness beneath the house. The air grew colder as he descended, carrying the metallic scent of damp stone and something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. His flashlight flickered over shelves of rusted jars and broken tools until it found a small drawer set into the foundation wall. It was locked, but the wood crumbled easily under pressure. Inside were several glass negatives wrapped in cloth, and beneath them, an old camera, its lens cracked but still glinting faintly under the light. The negatives were marked only with initials and dates: 1892, 1894, 1897. He held one up to the beam of his flashlight, and the image came alive in a ghostly shimmer of black and white. The first photo showed a group of children standing in front of the farmhouse, their faces blurred not by damage, but by deliberate smudging, as if someone had tried to erase them by hand. The second was clearer. 3 children sat on a wooden bench, their expressions blank, their eyes unfocused, their bodies twisted in ways that defied anatomy. A fourth figure stood behind them, partially cropped out of the frame, only a hand visible resting on a child's shoulder. The hand was gloved, but the shape of it, long narrow fingers bent slightly at the joints, seemed wrong. The last image was the most disturbing. A single child sitting alone in what looked like the attic, her eyes reflecting the flash like an animal's, her mouth open as though caught mid-scream or mid-laugh. At the bottom of the drawer was a note written in the same trembling script as the Dr. S. letter. These were the ones they let me keep. The others were taken. As lightning flashed through the cracks in the boards above, the journalist realized the camera hadn't been meant to document deformity. It had been meant to prove something else. Someone had been watching those children not as patients, but as subjects, and somewhere more photographs might still exist.